You're listening to Through Help and Back. Through Help and Back is a podcast focused on mental health, addiction, treatment, recovery, and all things related to personal improvement and wellness. Don't worry, we're not here to talk about problems without solutions, and we're definitely not here to talk about struggles without success. So come with your problems, leave with our solutions. We are very, very, very excited today. We have an excellent guest, someone I've been really excited to talk to for a long time. Dr. Avi Sanders is with us here today. He is a psychologist practicing primarily in New Jersey and the New York area, but also has expanded his services out to nearly 30 states at this point. Dr. Sanders, or Avi, as he asked me to call him, so we're good friends, so I'll go with Avi, but you have to call him Dr. Sanders. Avi specializes in treating anxiety disorders. If you check out his content, Instagram, and all other platforms, he has some amazing interventions and some really creative ways of looking at that. He also works with couples and families as a father himself, and so really enjoys working with families as an effort to stabilize the family system and help children. So, Avi, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very excited.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with the most important thing that we have in common. You and I are both basketball dads. So we have sons who are up and coming hoopers. And so my guy's getting into AAU season and has just finished up. How are your guys doing?
You're doing great. Yeah, I have twins. They're almost 10, full of life, challenging at times, but they give me a lot of joy.
We're outnumbered. You're 2-on-1 there because you've got twins. So I'll send my best wishes to you, and I'll remain grateful while I only have one son to wrestle around and keep up with. So
enjoy it while you can.
Absolutely. So Avi, tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into the healing arts and how you came to this position. You know, how did you get into this?
I had an interesting journey into psychology. I actually tried to run away from it for most of my life. My story in a nutshell is that I grew up with mental illness in my family. I had a brother who struggled with schizophrenia, still does, but he's doing much better. And part of me wanted to avoid this world because as a kid, it was overwhelming. It caused me a lot of pain. It was very confusing. So I went the opposite direction and I became a lawyer. I was bored out of my mind. But actually being a lawyer was the first time that I really had to confront my anxiety. I had a lot of social anxiety, public speaking, performance anxiety, and I had to litigate a lot in court. So that was a great space for me to start working on my own anxiety. But I was really bored. It wasn't stimulating for me. I love people. I love connection. I love to get to know people. So I went a step farther and I went into organizational psychology. And I did a lot of training and development, but something was still missing. And only in my late 30s, I finally came to psychology and I went to graduate school. And once I went there, it really clicked and it was a love affair. And I loved every moment. And I say, if I didn't have to make money, I would be doing the same work for free because I love my clients. I love this work. It's so rewarding. And people ask me, do you do it because you like to help people? I say, no, I do it because I like to connect with people. Because I think the therapy space is so intimate and you connect with someone on a very meaningful level. And to me, that is the best thing to do in the world. I can't imagine myself doing anything else.
I really like that switch between to help people or connect with people, because I think the first is what the common, phrasing around this profession is. And, I've been a therapist for a long time, and that's what people would say as well. You want to help people. But without that connection, there really is no help, right? Because to help people implies that you have a secret list of interventions and you just give them that and life is good. But it really is that deep connection that is the basis, I think, for the healing relationships. So another thing that you talked about there that's very interesting too is having the experience of being a family member of somebody who is struggling with a mental illness. And rightfully so. In our field, the client is a big focus of everything that's happening, right? But there is a lot of impact around and the people that love them. So what, without too much gruesome detail, but what was that like to witness that and experience that, in somebody that you love?
Yeah. First of all, I think I was 6 when my brother was diagnosed, so I think it was in the beginning very confusing and scary. I was also a latchkey kid. I don't know if people know this term.
Yeah, I was one too. Yeah.
Yeah, you were.
Yeah, young people like Ian can't handle that, but we were like wandering the streets with our key around the.
Exactly. So I was 6, and I would come home, open the door with my key. And I think, I don't know how to explain that, but since I was 6, I always had this gut feeling if it's safe for me to stay or I should leave, right? So I think that was the first place where I started becoming very attuned to other people. So I can pick up on other people's moods very, very quickly. And I think this was my training ground for that. But I think through this process, I also saw the process that my family and my parents especially were going through, because initially it was very confusing for them, and I think they were in denial. But slowly they came to terms with what it means to have a son with such an illness and how to cope with that. And eventually they learned how to help him become more independent. And now actually he's living an overall rewarding life, which is to me remarkable. But it was also part of my growth, because I ended up writing my dissertation in graduate school about siblings of people with mental illness. So my process with him became a part of my own professional journey. And I think it also affects my thinking about clients. I don't think about the client individually. I think about the client in a context, right? And the context can be the family, it can be where they live, it can be the school they go to, it can be what's going on in the country, right? A lot is going on in this country as well. I'm thinking about their race, their sexual orientation. There's a broad context that we want to consider when we're trying to help someone or connect with someone, if we want to really understand their experience.
Yeah, I really connect with that, because I think about people like Bateson and Keeney and even Mnuchin with family systems, to grab the client and just work on the symptoms and sort of almost like a checklist. We need to stop this. We need more of that. We need less of this. That medical model piece, I think, loses the context and loses all those factors that are sometimes almost impossible to define. Like, how do you put a percentage on it? It's 20% because of your family and 40% because of your genetics and another 20 because of culture. It's just impossible. I mean, we're just so complex, and the systems that play upon us and facilitate those symptoms. I think that's amazing that you're kind of considering the whole system. So with that being your dissertation, I mean, were you, because now a lot of your practice is focused on anxiety and focused on treating that, and was that something that you had an interest in grad school as well, and it developed as part of that? Or is that something that's sort of reactive to the population? Like, are you just seeing more anxiety and felt like I've got to get, better at this? And I mean, how did that develop as your primary focus?
Yeah, I think in general, my personal process and my personal experience affects what I tend to gravitate towards. So as I said before, I struggle with anxiety. I was a very anxious kid for different reasons, and social anxiety was a big component of my anxiety. So I went through my own process of understanding anxiety. I have some family members that are really close to my heart that struggle with anxiety. And I would say that almost organically in my practice, I would say that 70 or 80% of my clients struggle with anxiety. So it almost like my personal and my professional life sometimes collide. And that becomes an interest. And what I love about anxiety, that my relationship with anxiety, understanding of anxiety, the way that I relate to anxiety is evolving all the time. I'm almost like growing with my understanding of anxiety. And I have to tell you, if that's okay, a quick story.
Please.
When I was in graduate school, it was a 5 years process. And the first class that you're taking is called an intake class. An intake is basically learning how to interview a new client. So we worked in pairs and we went and interviewed clients, and then we would come to the class and present the case to the professor. And then we'll decide what is the treatment plan together. So my first client, and I was very excited. It was my first intake, first time sitting with a client. I had like butterflies in my stomach. He was struggling with panic attacks. It's the first time that I heard somebody describing a panic attack, and it sounded so overwhelming and painful. So I'm presenting this case to my professor in the class, and I'm asking, was there anything that we could give him during the intake that we could that he can use while he's waiting for the treatment to begin, because it sounds so painful. So my professor told me, just giving some type of a breathing exercise. And I genuinely asked, what breathing exercise? That was my first class, maybe like first week or second week in graduate school, said some breathing exercise. So I realized that he never gave a breathing exercise to a client. And he was a wonderful psychologist.
Sure.
Right? But he didn't give any concrete tools when he was working with clients. And I said, that's not what I want to do. Like, if that was my client and I was the therapist, I wanted to give him something on the first session that he can go home with. And over time, I discovered that when somebody is anxious, you can do insight work, right? When somebody is anxious, they can't breathe. They want something right now that will help them feel better. And once the anxiety subsides, you can talk about other things. So I think that was like already like in my first or second week of school, I said, well, when it comes to anxiety or to certain issues, like I want to learn what to do beyond just giving insight or just revising or examining thoughts. I want to have concrete tools to give people so they start feeling better. I think this was my first encounter with anxiety in therapy.
It's really interesting and almost like a Steve Jobs-esque kind of way how your life experiences connect to bring you to this place where they're all useful, you know? The famous story about him is he dropped out of school and he had to take one class to stay in student housing. So he took a calligraphy class, right? So he didn't have to go home and announce his embarrassment over dropping out of school. And what he learned in there about the impact of form and different writing styles showed up in Microsoft Word. And that's why one of the reasons it became like the dominant program is people liked having all of the font choices. And it's like, if you look backwards, it makes perfect sense why you went through these experiences, right? But in the moment, it could be kind of confusing, like what is going on here? So, you had mentioned that like 70 to 80% of your clients, are dealing with some sort of anxiety. I've dealt with anxiety myself. I've shared that on here and maybe I'll tell some stories here in a moment. But, I would say it's very similar in our practice as well. We're seeing a great deal of it. Certainly it's gone up since the pandemic and things of that nature. But do you have any theories or thoughts on why we're seeing so much of that, why anxiety has become so prevalent in our world today?
I think this is such a complex question, so I'm just going to throw out some ideas and you can chime in. I think that we have to think about why we have this feeling, this experience to begin with, right? So if you think about our ancestors, they had anxiety too, but when would they have anxiety? They're roaming the woods or the desert or wherever they lived and they see a bear or a tiger. And their nervous system takes over and anxiety kicks in, right, to save them. And within like a brief second, they have to decide what to do. Am I going to fight? Am I going to run away, right? That's the fight or flight. Or maybe it makes more sense to collapse, to go into a free state. That is what will save me, right? And this is not a conscious decision. This is your nervous system taking over. This is an automatic pilot. But it's over within 10 seconds, maybe 50 seconds. And you go back to normal. Now think about the stressors that we're dealing with, right? So I work with clients who work for a company that just laid off 10% of its workforce. And there are rumors in the office, right, that there will be another round of layoffs. And now they have to carry this anxiety not for 50 seconds, but they might carry this anxiety for days, for weeks, for months, right? Think about people who struggle financially, who have to pay a mortgage. And they're very anxious about it. And again, they have to carry this anxiety for extended periods of time. Our nervous system is not wired to tolerate this experience for more than few seconds. So if you have to carry this experience chronically for a long time, it starts to take a toll on you. And this is the burnout, right? So I think this is one idea that I wanted to share with you about why I think we see so much anxiety, because the stressors are very different. So I think this is one component of why anxiety is so much more prevalent these days.
Yeah, we're kind of a middle generation here. We've got old operating systems, but new age stressors, right? And so we haven't evolutionarily made the transition. And who knows if we will make the transition? Who knows if we want to make that transition? But yeah, we're doing sprint work over the course of a marathon, and that's. No, I've never seen anybody sprint a marathon, right? So that's tough. And I think about you as well. And I work with a lot of children, and your experience you described about, I could almost tell when I walked in the door whether I needed to stay or go, right? So that's a child who has a constant, at least sense of danger, if not actual danger in the home. And I've heard lots of children talk about that have abusive parents, right? I could tell by the way Dad opened the front door, or the way he closed his car door, or the way if he ran to the fridge and got a beer instead of, an iced tea, I knew it was going to be a bad night, And so you wire yourself to constantly monitor, for threats. So in your example of the evolutionary man, when he sees a tiger or a bear, some people are living with tigers and bears. And so.
Yeah, and I think you're alluding to, another source of why we see so much anxiety, and I think that's trauma, right? There's so much trauma that people are going through that was never addressed. And what do we do with trauma? Many times we want to dissociate. We don't want to think about it. We don't want to talk about it because we don't want to relive it. It's very scary. It's very painful. It's very overwhelming. But the trauma is manifesting in other ways. And I think anxiety is one way in which untreated trauma expresses itself. So I think if you ask me, that's another reason why we see so much anxiety these days.
And this may be a sense of awareness or education, but that word trauma has shown up a lot more recently too, right? From the adverse childhood experiences and things like that. I think people are aware of that word trauma, but I think it means something different to every individual person. And so there's that little bit of like, well, he's had it worse than me. Do I even have a right to have trauma or experience trauma? So let's unpack that a little bit if you don't mind. If you have somebody who comes into your practice and you either reveal or identify trauma with them, or they come in and say, like, you said you haven't processed, you haven't done the work around that trauma. Like, what does that look like for you and your patients? How do you get into that work, and how do you help them work through traumatic experiences?
Yeah, if you think about that, one basic element of trauma is lack of safety, right? And when I say lack of safety, it's not people immediately think just physical safety, right? You mentioned maybe an abusive parent, maybe a violent parent, but it can be emotional, right? We need to feel safe because we're social creatures. So we want to feel safe physically, but also emotionally. So if we want to work with trauma in our practice, the first thing that we need to do is to establish a sense of safety.
Yeah.
And this is where I always start. And I say, to establish a sense of safety, I said, few things need to happen here. One is that the control is in your hands, you being the client, right? So that means you decide if we talk about it, when we talk about it, how much we talk about it, where do we start to talk about it? It's not my decision. Your foot is on the gas pedal and on the brake. And you tell me we can accelerate a little bit, and you can tell me we can slow down. So I think pacing is such a key element of trauma work. And the client needs to hold a sense of agency to pace themselves. I think this is so, so crucial. And usually when you present it this way to clients, you see the immediate relief, right? Because the trauma was lack of control, lack of agency, right? And you're giving it to them, and that's very empowering. So I think this is where it should start, and that's really the foundation. We can talk more about that, but I think this is one of the key elements of working with trauma.
No, I think you're right, because you think about our fears that we walk around with, and sort of like fear of flying and things like that. It's like they won't let you in the cockpit to help out, right? You're just along for the ride. And that can be a very kind of traumatic, trauma-inducing experience. So, one thing I did want to touch on too, and this may be just sort of clean up rather than issue specific, is just for education of our listeners. So you're a psychologist, right? And so a lot of times people kind of get things overlapped in terms of like therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, and things like that. So can you tell me a little bit about, one, why you pursued being a psychologist, like what you found attractive about that, and then where you fit? Like if somebody is looking to go work with a psychologist, what does that mean as opposed to, psychiatry or therapy? Like how do you see your role in sort of that process?
I think the psychiatrists are coming from the medical model, right? So they give a diagnosis, right? There's an illness, and usually they will be the ones who prescribe medication, right? And that's a legitimate way of treating whatever you're struggling with, right? And for some people, that is very helpful and sometimes necessary, right? So I'm not making a statement against it.
Sure, of course.
But that's my thinking about medication. Let's talk about medication for anxiety or for depression, right? These are medication that are very, very common these days. And they are being prescribed even by primary care physicians, not just psychiatrists. So I always tell to my clients, again, I empower them, like, it's your decision to take medication or not, right? But even if you decide to take medication, there are reasons why you feel depressed. There are reasons why you feel anxious. And usually when they come to therapy, their anxiety or depression are very intense, right? We can feel feelings, but each feeling has intensity. So I can be frustrated, I can be angry, and I can be enraged. So it's almost like the same feeling, but the volume is very different. The same with anxiety, it's the same with depression. So usually somebody who goes to see a therapist or a psychiatrist, they have anxiety or depression, but the volume is very high. Let's use a scale of 1 to 10. Maybe it's a 9 or a 10. I tell them, if you decide to take medication, that can be helpful. It's going to dial down the volume, maybe to 5, maybe to 6, maybe to 4, but it will still be there. And now you have to do some work on understanding why you feel depressed, why you feel anxious. And unless you work on the sources of your feeling, things will not get better. We're not fixing, quote unquote, fixing feelings. What we're fixing is the sources of the feelings, right? So if the source of my anxiety is trauma, I have to work on the trauma, right? If the source of my anxiety is my relationship, I have to work on my relationship. If the source of my anxiety is parenting, I have to work on parenting. Just taking a medication is not going to eliminate, right, the anxiety if we focus just on anxiety. But I think it applies to other issues. So that is where I would start in explaining the difference between psychiatry and therapy. And to me, therapy is about exploring the sources and working on the sources of the feeling. Right. I don't know if that is.
No, it's great. No, it's absolutely great. It's spot on. I think sometimes people get lost in the terminology game and things that are very easy for us to understand in terms of like shorthand, right? Like that's what the DSM is. It's just a shorthand for a collection of symptoms, like, oh, that's a borderline. Like we know like there's 9 criteria or whatever they're right. Like somebody else is like, what does the world does that mean? And sometimes when people are asking for help, they don't know where to go, right? Do I need a therapist? Do I need a psychologist? Do I need a psychiatrist? And so knowing how to take that first step. And one thing to emphasize, I think, is there really is no wrong first step. If you go to a psychiatrist, it doesn't mean you're absolutely going to get medication. That's obviously the lens they see the world through, but they should be referring you to psychologists and therapists and things like that if that's what's necessary, and vice versa. If you go to a psychologist or a therapist, doesn't mean you can't get medication assistance as well. There's a combination there, and in every case is different. When you talk about doing the work for you, I was kind of thinking about your personal story as we were sitting here and thinking about you dealing with, the anxiety that you dealt with, and it turned into social anxiety. And you've got a couple things going on there in terms of the work that you had to do. And your brief tenure as a lawyer kind of helped a lot, push you into the arena and force that. So was that the work you needed to do to deal with your own anxiety, was just getting in there and facing it over and over? Or was there some background work and understanding that you had to develop as well?
Until I was much older, nobody named it for me, right? I think many of the people who listen to us might for the first time say, maybe we have anxiety, right? Maybe we struggle with anxiety, because nobody named it for me. But I remember that when I was a young lawyer, they would send me to court on behalf of a more senior lawyer for 3 minutes, right? Just maybe to schedule trial dates. So it would be a 3 minutes appearance in court. I wouldn't sleep for 4 or 5 weeks, right? And nothing helped me until somebody gave me, it was actually my mom. She gave me such a quick and simple and doable idea, which down the road as a psychologist, I learned was mindfulness. She didn't use the term mindfulness. I don't think that she knew what's mindfulness. is, but that's what she told me. She said, instead of focusing on controlling the symptoms of anxiety, right, which was my hands were shaking, my voice was shaking, I felt a pit in my stomach, my heart was racing, and I said, oh my God, everybody can see that, and I have to control that. We just made the anxiety worse. She told me, just focus on what you need to say. It doesn't matter if your voice is shaking. It doesn't matter if your hands are shaking. Just say what you have to say. That is mindfulness, right?
Yep.
Is where she asked me to place my attention. I didn't know what it is. Now I work with mindfulness because I learned what it is. I learned how it worked, and I offer it to my clients as one tool. So it took me time to learn the skills, and I'm still learning, right? Like I recently did a course on trauma. I have more tools to work with anxiety. And I'm sure that if I will talk to you in 6 months from now, I will have more ideas and more tools. So it's an ongoing process for me. It's never over.
And I think that's impressive, just from practitioner to practitioner, your ongoing development. It's very easy. I mean, they make us do CEUs and things like that, but it's very easy to get the degree and go, okay, I'm good. Like I'm done, but the world is changing. The understanding is changing. You kind of have to stay you have to be a lifelong learner, I think, to do this really well. So, when you talk about nobody naming that for you, do you want to help, our listeners and kind of name that now? Like, I mean, what do you look for, when you assign an anxiety diagnosis, or what may be some things that people are experiencing that you're like, hey, this isn't just a bad day, or kind of that differential between anxiety and depression. Like, if somebody is experiencing these things, like how do they name that for themselves, or how do they say, okay, maybe time to talk to somebody who can name this for me?
Again, great question. And there are so many ways to answer that. Let's talk about 2 or 3 ways to answer that, and you tell me what resonates, and
sure, great, yeah.
Throw one of those more in depth. So I think I shared with you the story when we met before this interview. Many times, most of my clients will come through the door, and I ask them, what do you want to work on? And they say, we want to get rid of our anxiety. And I said, I don't work with dead people. They said, what do you mean you don't work with dead people? I said, first, you're alive, right? You're breathing, right? I said, dead people, they don't feel anxiety. They don't feel angry. They don't feel embarrassed, ashamed, right? But they don't feel happy. They don't feel proud. They don't feel stimulated or engaged, right? You're human like me, and we feel all of these feelings, right? So feeling anxiety per se is not a problem. What is the problem? I ask this client, tell me how anxiety gets in your way, right? So if he was a lawyer like me, he said, like, I cannot appear in court and I want to be a good lawyer. Oh, okay. So let's work on managing your anxiety in such a way that you can appear in court and do a good job, right? That's the goal. So the goal is to help you live a rich life, a meaningful life, whatever that means for you. That's a personal question, right? And if anxiety gets in the way, then it's something that you need to work on. Right. So if for a listener who is like listening today and saying, I want to go on dates, but I'm too anxious, right? I feel too self-conscious. I feel that they won't like me or they will reject me, and it's overwhelming for me and too painful. I hear that this client wants to find a date or a partner, right? Which is a healthy wish, but anxiety stands in the way. Okay, so let's do some work so it won't be so overwhelming, so painful, and definitely not paralyzing. So I think that's one way to think about it. I'm going to pause here.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think that's really great, because when you go through the DSM, right, like almost all the diagnoses, and DSM being the statistical, diagnostic and statistical manual, it's kind of our blueprint for assigning these labels. But there's always a criteria in there that talks about how it has caused like persistent disruption in their life for a period of time, right? And so that's a big piece of it. So for me and a lot of my work, I like to think about how very rarely are we in a fixed state, right? Like you're feeling the anxiety now, you're not going to feel it forever. You're not 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So my curiosity is always around what's different during the times when you're not feeling it, right? But also implying that there are going to be times that you're not feeling it, right? And so for me, that's a big piece of it. Is this something that's been on your mind for a week? You got rejected for using your example. You try to talk to a girl or a guy and it didn't go well. And so now you're reacting to that. Well, that may not be an anxiety disorder. That may be a very natural, emotional reaction. You're kind of riding those waves of ups and downs. So I think that's interesting because I think the period of time and how it's causing disruption is really important, because if you didn't know the word anxiety or, whatever, but you could function properly as a litigator, you were in meaningful relationships, you had fun and hobbies, you wouldn't really probably seek out Avi and say, I've got problems. You would just say, I feel this kind of way, but I'm still doing these things. So I think the impact on life is really important. And the way you weave it in with purpose and that meaningful life, I like that a lot because it casts the vision down the road. It's not just in the car hyperventilating on a Tuesday. It's like you're moving towards these bigger and better things. So that's interesting.
I think another way to think about it is your level of distress, right? So usually I help my clients to map out their nervous system. And I say we have 3 states, right? There's a safe state, right? So think about a moment where you felt safe physically and emotionally, right? And then I ask them to pay attention to how that feels in their body. And how do they think in this moment? And what feelings come up for them in this moment, right? And how do they sleep when they're in safe? And do they use substances in safe, right? Do they display any compulsive behaviors in safe? So that's the first state of our nervous system. But there are 2 more states, right? There's the fight or flight, right? There's a trigger, something external or internal that overwhelms your system and registers as dangerous or overwhelming or highly stressful. And then you go into a fight or flight. The hallmark of fight or flight is this rush of cortisol and adrenaline, right? So you feel a lot of energy in your system. It's very different than the safe, right? Imagine how it would be if your kid is dropping the ball and starts running to the street. You'll probably go into a fight or flight, right? And then I ask them, like, what's going on right now in your body? How do you feel in your body, right? It's very different than being in safe. People feel it in their shoulders, their back, their chest, their stomach, right? Their muscles are tensing up. Their breathing is shifting. They feel a pit in their stomach. Some people sweat, some people shake. It's a very different experience. And I ask them, how do you think in this state? And what do you feel in this state, right? And how do you sleep when you're in this state? And do you tend to consume certain substances in this state? And what compulsive behaviors you engage with when you are in this state, right? So we learn this fight or flight state. And then there's another state, right? If our nervous system decided that whatever is dangerous or overwhelming is beyond our capacity, our system starts to shut down. And that's what we call the immobilize, collapse, freeze state. And that's the opposite of having all this energy. Almost all the energy is leaving your body. You're just collapsing. You want to be left alone. You're waiting for the storm to pass. And then it feels very differently in your body, right? You feel very differently. You think very differently. So I say to a client, if you find yourself a lot in one of the other 2 states, in the fight or flight or the collapse state, you need to do some work. Something is going on. We need to figure out what's causing that. Because as we said in the beginning of the conversation, we're not meant to be in these states for too long. And I think many of us these days are spending a lot of time in fight or flight or collapsed. And that requires some work. Yeah.
Before we go on, I want to say a few words about Anew Behavioral Health. Anew Behavioral Health is an outpatient provider of mental health and substance abuse services in Ohio and New Hampshire. That means that Anew can successfully treat mental health and substance abuse issues or dual diagnosis if you're struggling with both. Their integrated approach allows for them to successfully address issues related to anxiety, depression, addiction, trauma, and really anything that stands between your life and the life you could be living. You really cannot bring them an issue that they have not successfully treated. They have also solved one of the biggest problems for people seeking help. They have a dedicated team waiting to hear from you at helpnow@anewbh.com. If you contact them today, within 24 hours, you will have heard back from, wait for this, a real live person, and will also have your first appointment scheduled at that time. So how do you contact them? Well, if you're in Ohio or New Hampshire, you're probably close to one of their local locations. You're welcome to go in. If not, you can always reach them online at anewbh.com. And if you're interested in services for you or loved one, use that address, helpnow@anewbh.com. Yeah, for me, I'm thinking about your 3 states, and I appreciate you sharing that. When I was doing my work, I was not given those specific terms, right? Like I was working as a therapist and I had an understanding of this, but I had started to experience some symptoms and panic attacks and things like that of that nature. And having that frame would have really helped me a lot, because my process was it tended to escalate pretty quick. As soon as I felt I don't want to say inappropriate, but like I would feel sensations that didn't match my situation. I'm just driving in the car. It's a sunny day, a little bit of a breeze. Now I'm feeling something in my chest. 60 seconds later, I'm down the road and I'm feeling it, right? I'm locking up into that second state. And I would have a refractory period after a panic attack that I would sort of, your collapse state that you talked about. So having that understanding would have been helpful. It's interesting to learn it now after the fact. and I'm thinking back to those days and those moments and go, that's okay. I was in stage 1, stage 2, and 3.
Funny that you use these terms, because I have a couple that I worked with. And by the way, like knowing the states is also crucial for couples work.
Yeah.
When do couples get stuck? When they try to connect or to resolve something from stage 2 and 3. I was thinking about this couple that's how they term the stages 1, 2, and 3. And they will tell me in a session, oh, you know what? This week we were in 2, fight or flight, but we learned not to engage, take care of our nervous system, right? So couples get stuck when they try to engage, connect, resolve a conflict or pain from fight or flight or collapse. It never works, right? So I think knowing the states is important for anxiety, right? Panic attacks, what you described, but also to other areas of our life.
Yeah, it helps us think about what is appropriate to kind of ask of ourselves in that moment. And if we know we're in a state that we can't ask as much as when we're sort of fully functional or in a different state, it really, in a moment, kind of alleviates some of that responsibility and kind of like loosens the stress, because like, well, of course I can't do that. I'm not in the right stage or the right state for that. And so then I can feel it as I'm talking about it. The pressure of being able to do that kind of goes down a little bit, right? It's like you can't fully concentrate when you're tired. So knowing that you're tired, you don't demand of yourself what you would if you were well rested. And there's some freedom in that. I'm off the hook, because it's like I don't have to worry about that.
And I think I want to say it's not only that to give ourselves permission to do whatever we need to do. When you're in this state, what you need to engage with is self-care and compassion. And again, like people don't get it, so I usually give them this story. I say, imagine that you walk down the street right now and you see a young kid running and he trips over the pavement, falls and starts crying, right? And now you can respond to this kid in 2 ways. You can go to this kid, right? And you can say to this kid, oh, I'm so sorry. It was so scary and unpredictable. It must have hurt. Let me help you to get up. You help them to brush off their clothes. Like maybe you give them a pat on the shoulder and you say, you're okay now. Are you okay? Right? That's response number 1. Response number 2, you can go to this kid and say, what is wrong with you? Didn't you see this pavement? Like, why are you running? You should walk slowly. If you would walk slowly, you wouldn't trip on the pavement. And people, I say, how would you respond to this kid? And everybody tells me, who would respond with the other response, right? Like, I would be compassionate. And now I ask them, how do you respond to your anxiety? They beat themselves up, right? How do we speak to our anxiety? I don't like you. Why are you here? Stop it. Go away. What is wrong with you, right? And what happens to our anxiety? It's tensing up. What would happen to this kid if we will scream at him? He will start crying even more, right? So it's really a lot of the work is to change the way that you relate to your anxiety, to your inner child, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? To this part of you is tensing up, that is scared, right? And yelling at this part or being harsh with this part, it's just going to intensify to make it more painful, right? So when you feel anxious, think about it as a young child inside of you that needs you, Jason, the adult, to comfort the child, right? We can talk about how to do that, but this concept is very important, right? When I offer resources to clients, I say, the intention is not to get rid of the anxiety. The intention is to comfort the anxiety.
Mm.
And when we learn to comfort, like we would comfort our children or a young child that tripped on the street, right? The anxiety weighs up because now it has support from you. And that transition, mental transition, to me is crucial, right? So if we go back to the client in the first session that wants to get rid of the anxiety, we get to a point where we understand that that's a part of him that it needs a very gentle, loving approach. And I think this is a big part of the work. So it's not just giving a technique. We can talk about strategies and resources and techniques, which are very important, but the thinking behind them is important too. I'm trying to comfort and soothe myself, not to beat myself up or get rid of something. I think this thinking can be a game changer for people. At least it was for me.
No, I agree 100%. And something that I've been doing a little bit with my work is talking with people about, would you be friends with somebody who talked to you like you talk to you, right? And most cases, the answer is absolutely not, right? We have them write down all of their inner monologue, and it's nasty and it's tough and it's ugly, and it's the Freudian critical mother over and over and over and over, right? And you say, okay, now if I said these things to you, would you still come see me? Would we be friends if I could talk to you? Then why is it okay for you to talk to you? You know? And I think that shift from somebody who needs assistance and aid away from somebody who screwed up, messed up, is broken, has just an internal problem. You know, what's wrong with you versus how can I help you? Having that conversation with yourself, I agree. I think it is a real game changer. We're not very nice to ourselves. And why not? Why not? Dr. Avi, you're a doctor. You have all the answers. Why aren't we very nice to ourselves? Why do we do that? How does that develop?
So I'm going to present a big idea, and I don't know if you agree or not, right? That's my experience through this work, through my own experience. I think most of us were raised by parents that, for a good reason, and I will explain why, didn't attend to emotions. We were raised by parents that were busy with survival.
Yep.
I love my parents. God bless them. They did the best that they could. But for them, parenting was, if I give you a place to live and I give you food, right, then I'm doing my work as a parent. And if you think about where they started and what happened to our grandparents, that makes perfect sense. There was a lot of emphasis on survival, but it came at the expense of emotions, right? Our emotional world was really neglected, right? Nobody helped us to understand what are emotions, how to name emotions, how to relate to emotions. So I think as a generation, we were almost like catching up. We're doing the catch-up work, right? And I think I see parents today much more interested in the emotional world of their children, right? This industry of parenting coaching, it's blossoming right now. Ask your parents if they ever heard about parenting coaching. They will be like, what are you talking about, right?
Yeah.
It didn't exist. So I think like we're catching up, and what we were talking about earlier, right, is how to understand emotions, how to name emotions, how to relate to emotions. And that's the compassion, right? That's the curiosity about what's going on inside, rather than being harsh and say, just go away. Right. So I think that this is one idea that I have. I don't know what are your ideas about why we don't know how to talk to ourselves or to relate to these more vulnerable emotions. This is my thought. Yeah.
No, I like that. And I actually was going to go there, but you've opened the door. I was thinking about your parents as we were talking with, you know, I know you were nervous, you had some anxiety that you're dealing with, your brother obviously having, other issues. I was curious about how your parents did handle that. Were they more, like you described, kind of the functional state where we're going to take care of food and we're going to take care of lodging, or did it change how they parented or how they viewed themselves or functioned as parents as they became more aware of the issues that you were dealing with and your brother was dealing with? Because I think about the caregivers all the time. And, I have 2 children, and knock on wood, luckily everything seems to be going along smoothly right now, but that can change. It can change very quickly. It did for me. And I wonder what kind of parent I would become if I had children with those issues. So I'm curious how your parents reacted and how they dealt with that.
I think it's interesting. It's almost like similar to what we said. When we want to learn to manage emotions, whether it's anxiety or anger or sadness, whatever it is, we first have to know that it's there, right? and what is it and what it's called, and to name that, right? We can talk about, there's a lot of research where just naming an emotion, whether you do it for yourself or you do it for someone else, can be such a powerful intervention, right? That's interesting. We can talk about it. So I think almost like if I take this approach to what happened to my parents, they went through a process of naming what my brother has, because it was confusing, right? So when somebody named it for them and said schizophrenia, right, that was the beginning of the change, right? But then you have to accept that, right? And that relates to what we said about our emotions. Like when you name that you have anxiety, do you want to get rid of that? Or are you willing to accept it? Because acceptance is the way forward. So I think that, like, what we're talking about, my family process is also like similar to the process of how I learned to deal with my own anxiety and to help clients deal with their own anxiety.
No, the naming and acceptance takes me to a place where we're dealing with a lot of issues around, being transgendered and things like that. And it's funny, I think that's one that is definitely a sticking point for current parents when they have children who are bringing that issue up or talking about that. And I've seen everything from a full embracing of that and how that can go. And I've seen a full rejection of that, where it's like, no, this is something you've been taught, and I've seen kind of everything in between. But that combined with the naming is so key to setting the stage for success, because I know I work from a solution-focused perspective, and so reframing is a huge part of what we do, right? And so anxiety, like I'll often ask clients, okay, if you've never heard that word, how would you describe this? Like, what would you call this, right? And if I can get them to the place of nervous or jittery or excited even, right? There maybe is a positive, misattribution of these signals. Like, I'm just excited, but I'm interpreting it as anxiety. I think it's so key. I think the area in which you're talking about is so important, because it just sets the stage and the structure for what that healing process is going to be like. Because if you start with broken child, you start with rejection, there's not a lot of room for solutions in that. I mean, what can you build on, How do you approach parents like that have that rejection sense, or no, not my child, or that couldn't be true, or that's a misdiagnosis, or, how do you help foster that acceptance and bring them around to, their new reality?
I think that what helped to heal is connection, right? And I think, again, that's a big part of my work, but I think that's a big part of the human reality. When we're hurting, like, connection can be so healing. Right. I heard this expression before, which I think is beautiful. We wound in relationships and we heal in relationships. Right. So if a parent that is struggling to accept their child is coming to me beating them up, criticizing them, or saying, what is wrong with you? Right. It's not going to help them. So I have to connect with them first. And I think usually the best place to start is to ask them, what are you afraid of? Because I've never met a controlling parent. I met a lot of anxious parents. Right?
Yeah.
So when I hear that, and I'm going to my own struggle and process as a parent, right? And what am I doing when I'm anxious, right? So usually parents bring a lot of anxiety to the table, and most of them, right? There are exceptions. Most of them are not bad people. But they're worried, they're anxious. So if you start there, this is a very, very very good place to open up the space for curiosity. And when you empathize with someone, they can become curious. And that's what you need from these parents, right? Because if you are curious about them, ideally they will become curious about their kid. And then the space is opening up for new possibilities. That is the bucket list, right?
No, that's very wise, because we talk about the word acceptance, but there's so many stages and steps before acceptance, and curiosity is a great place to begin. And working with an anxious parent, as you say, or a resistant parent, you may not be able to talk about acceptance right now. That may be so far down the road. It's like, you're speaking a different language, but you can be curious. Don't you want to understand this better? Don't you want to know more about this? And then your "what are you afraid of" line is amazing, because it brings to mind, to me, the old, one of my favorite phrases, the hurt people kind of thing, right? And so it's like, when I see that, like, you're hurting your child through this approach, like, who hurt you? Let me understand where this is coming from, and understanding that generational approach to that, I think, gives them permission to talk about what may be behind those feelings. And I want to call like a bunch of families right now and ask that exact question. Like, what are you afraid of? What are you afraid of? Because I think that's it. I think that's a lot of that. Like, you don't want to reject your child. That's not the goal. So what are you afraid of? If this is true, like, what does that bring into your reality? And where do you go from there? So that's interesting. It's interesting. As your relationship, I'm sure, obviously, as everybody is, you're an adult now and things have changed. With you and your parents, like looking back on those times and looking back on that development, do they see the progression as well? Are you guys at a place of good understanding where we went through this and now we see it in a different light, kind of thing?
It's funny. I never held resentment against my parents. Because I really believe, and that's what I believe about myself and my clients, myself as a therapist, as a parent, as a partner, as a friend, as a son, as a brother. We always do the best that we can, but we can do better, right? And I really saw my parents like evolving over the years. As an adult child, they were the most amazing, wonderful, present parents that one can ask for, right? And I understand that whatever they did when I was younger was not with the intention of hurting me. They just did the best that they could. And they were surviving too.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if I can be patient with them, it's also permission for me to be patient with myself, right? I feel as a parent, but I'm doing the best that I can, and I can do better. And that is why my work and my journey and my process. That's what works for me.
And as a parent of twin boys, I'm sure you don't need that patience very often. I'm sure it's
it's a boy and a girl actually, but
okay, got you.
But you need a lot of patience, and even in parenting, what we talked about trauma, right? Like me understanding trauma and how trauma works, like really helped me to become also a better parent, because now I understand better when, as a parent, I go into a fight or flight state, right? And what can I do to regulate my own fight or flight state? Because, by the way, from a fight or flight, we can't connect with other people because this is a survival state. So when I'm in a fight or flight as a parent, right, my job is to take care of my nervous system to come back to safe. And then I want to connect and react to my kids. And again, we talked about couples, but it's true for parenting too. Where do we run into trouble with our kids is that when we respond from a survival state, which is fight or flight or collapsed, which are not connection states, right? So that was crucial for me, this work also for being a parent. And it's still ongoing.
I would add from that survival state, probably when they come from a place of fear as well, right? So my wife and I have experienced that personally where, our kids are great, but something will happen and it'll spark fears of, oh no, are they going to do this or are they going to be this? And one of us may respond from a place of like, well, this can't happen because it could lead to this other thing. And it's like, well, now you're in a fear state, right? Now we're almost inducing panic because we're predicting all the negative consequences or disasters that could happen. And that takes us out of the moment. In the moment, the child is asking for A, B, or C. They're not thinking about how they're going to manage their money when they're 25 years old. So the fact that they spent their allowance too quick, oh my gosh, they're going to be bad with money. We catastrophize, sometimes. It's like, let's come from a place of love here and get back into teaching and relax and understand that they're, 9 years old. So
they don't do their homework once and we immediately saying like they will not go to college, right?
You'll never get a job. Yeah, you're going to be homeless.
The fortune telling.
That's exactly right. Exactly. So, we've seen a progression here sort of generationally in terms of like when we were growing up, we really didn't have names for this stuff. Now we have names. Understanding is developing. Parenting is changing around that understanding. How do you see this progressing, whether it be sort of generationally or as parents? Do you predict that this understanding will lead to a reduction in anxiety because we'll be better parents, we'll have better understanding, better support? Or do you worry that there's some challenges out there evolutionarily or culturally that maybe, could even exacerbate things? Like what's next for us as a people in terms of how we deal with this?
I think you're touching on a few pieces of, I think, where we're heading, or I hope that that's where we're heading. I think we didn't touch on other pieces, so maybe we can name some of them. I think, yes, parenting is a big component, right? Addressing trauma, I think, is a big component, but also what's going on in the environment, right? That needs to be addressed too. I don't know how you were raised, but when I was growing up, there were no screens. So I would spend the majority of my time like playing outside, being in the sun, being active, moving, connecting, right? So much healthier.
Mm-hmm.
My kids today are doing something very different. They're much less active. They spend more time on screens, right? They eat very different foods, much more processed food. I think these are also components that affect anxiety, right? And I think we will have to work on that as well. So I think when we work on these big issues, I'm hoping that we'll start to head in the right direction. We teach kids what are emotions, how to talk about emotions, what to do with emotions, right? I think that's a big part of it. Working on trauma, and trauma is a big word, right? Racism is trauma, right?
Sure.
And we see a shift, but there's still a lot of work to do. What's going on in the environment, again, like that's a lot of work. Our relationship with screen, with social media, what we eat, how we move. I think working on all these big topics is where we're heading. I hope so, at least.
Yeah, no, I think you've nailed it. We work on that a lot here. We talk about that. The screen thing is I sound like 150 years old when I start talking about the screens. It's just like, get off those damn screens. But I think about it, I think about that a lot. Like, how is that changing their brains? How is it affecting even things like eyesight, like, and the nutrition piece of it. And I'll give you a real specific example that just happened last night. So my children, we demand a lot of outside time to kind of offset that, right? We don't keep them from their screens or whatever, but it's a balancing act. If you spend an hour on the screens, you guys are going to go outside for an hour. And we have no clue. There's this idea that there's a formula out there. We don't know. We just think like, well, it should balance it out a little bit. You should have both experiences. But my daughter, so like when I was young, you would ride your bike around and you would look for the house that had a pile of bikes in front of it, and you'd go knock on the door and be like, hey, let's play. Like, what are you guys doing, Well, now that's digital, right? And so we were doing a thing where there were some kids playing at our house and we were all going to go outside. And my daughter had come downstairs and said, well, but 3 of my friends from the gymnastics team are in a chat room. Can I get on this video call and, hang out with my friends? And it's a weird dilemma. It's a weird dilemma, right? Because you're like, okay, am I saying no because outside time is more important and whatever, or healthier in my mind? But in a way, she would interpret that as me depriving her as time with her friends.
And she's right in a way, by the way.
Oh, by the way, yeah. She got on the screen. We cut it in half, right? Like, you can't do an hour, you can do a half an hour so you can get your connection. So I don't think we have a blueprint for balancing that. And I don't think we can see around the corner and know exactly what's going to lead to, but it's certainly going to be different. And it's creating a lot of anxiety in parents as to how to manage it.
You're right. We can't eliminate that. It's part of our life. Even the two of us, we're talking about children's screen time. We're on screens right now, right?
Right.
And it's
yeah. But this is important. This is grown-up stuff. They're just
But reconnecting with our friends is very important too.
I know. You're right. You're right.
We can be hypocrites and bury our head in the sand. Like, we're not going to eliminate screens, but as you said, I love it. This is a balancing act, right? So what's the balance? What are we gaining from screens? And let's use that, but let's be aware of the downsides and manage that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and the other thing I want to talk about too, you talk about nutrition and the process stuff. Like, I assume that when you work with patients who are dealing with these issues, I mean, you talked about at the beginning of our conversation, you're looking at all factors. And so something I found very helpful for me during my time of dealing with that was I almost got to kind of a learned helplessness kind of state where I was like, nothing I'm doing is working with this anxiety. Like, so I had kind of made a commitment to myself at that time that, like, I'm going to get as healthy as I can around the anxiety, right? So I went to the doctor and got blood work done, and I had a sleep study done, and I had a nutritionist look at what I was eating. Obviously, I didn't stick with all of that, but for a period of time I did. And, and what I found actually was that the part of a chief contributor to my situation was I was sleeping really poorly. I was on this cycle of energy drinks to wake up, not sleeping well, not getting into REM sleep. And so just bad sleep hygiene, bad habits. Sometimes I'm going to bed at 10, sometimes I'm going to bed at 2, just all over the map. And so my resources were really depleted. I wasn't healthy enough to kind of like manage anxiety. So when I got into fight or flight situations, it was just burning out my available resources too quick because I didn't have as many. And it helped a lot. Once I got a grip on that, I started to see immediate improvement, and that gave me hope, and we cycle from there. So how do you deal with that with your clients? How do you approach that sort of holistic view to their own situation?
It's interesting that also evolved over the years. And now when I send an intake and it's being sent electronically, I ask about 5 areas of the body. And I encourage all of my clients to think about these 5 areas. And I try to do so for myself as well. So I think there are 5 areas of the body that we have to be very mindful what's going on there. Because I say if these 5 areas of the body are out of balance, 3 things will happen to your emotional system. Right, you're gonna start feeling the vulnerable feelings, the anxiety, the anger, the depression more frequently, more intensely, and it will take you more time to go back to your baseline. So even if your body is in perfect balance, you're still going to feel anxious, sad, frustrated, angry, and so this is normal and human. But you won't feel it too frequently, too intensely, and when it happens, you will be able to regulate yourself and go back to your baseline pretty quickly, right? The 5 areas that I focus on is, the first one is medical issues. If you have any medical conditions that are not being addressed or treated, that can affect your emotional system. So if you have thyroid issues, right, or digestive issues, and so on and so forth, blood pressure, that needs to be addressed, because that definitely can affect your mood. So I suggest just go to the doctor once a year, right?
Yeah.
Do the blood work, make sure that everything is okay, and if something needs your attention, then take care of that. The second one that you mentioned, sleep. Sleep is so crucial. Sleep deprivation, by the way, is a form of torture. And if you deprive, and they use it, unfortunately, right? When they torture captives, they use sleep deprivation. And if you deprive someone of sleep for an extended period of time, they can become psychotic.
Yep.
They can see and hear things. So I totally agree with you. If you were sleep deprived, your emotional system was out of balance. And that was possibly part of the panic attacks and the anxiety.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So medical issues, sleep, nutrition, right? What do you eat, right? Do you eat a balanced diet, or do you eat a lot of processed food that spike your mood and then make your mood crash, right? So pay attention to what you eat. And by the way, I have to give a lot of credit to psychiatry. There is right now an area of psychiatry called nutritional psychiatry that is actually talking about how certain foods help the brain cope with anxiety and depression. Fascinating, right? So we have medical conditions, we have sleep, we have nutrition, substances, right? Substances is another pandemic that we didn't talk about so far. And again, I'm not lecturing to anybody what to do, what is healthy or unhealthy, but by definition, substances affect the brain, and that's why we like them, right? Why do we drink coffee? Caffeine, it's a substance, it affects the brain, right? Pot, and here too.
No.
Right? Pot, smoking, alcohol, all these things affect the brain, and that's why we like them, right? But what are they doing to our emotional system, right? And the 5th area is movement and exercise. And people think that when I present it, I'm talking about going to the gym 5 times a week. No, I'm talking about walking, right? I say to my clients who live in New York and take the subway, you don't have time because you're so busy. Get off the subways 2 stops before you get to work, and 2 stops before you get home, and just walk these 2 stops. 45 minutes of walking can do wonders to your nervous system. So I think like being mindful of these 5 areas is really a big part of the work when you work on your anxiety.
Yep. And, you talked on substances, and I'm glad we talked about the everyday substances and the processed foods. And I mean, we're ingesting quite a bit of chemicals that we didn't in the past. And, the obvious advice, eat the ingredients, not the final product and things like that. It's a difficult thing for sure. The walking is huge, because even it's not only just the steps, I think, but also what's going on during that walk, right? They're around people, even in the city, you're getting around some nature, fresh air, you're out, you don't feel so, you're not processed all day as well. So what we do on our end, so I worked with a lot of folks on the substance issue who'd gotten out of control. I worked in addiction for a long time. And those 5 areas are amazing. Now we need to like list those and make sure those are really highlighted. That's really key. But we use HALT, right? So hungry, angry, lonely, tired. So if you're not attending to that, or you're in that state, we would always say, like, stop on making big decisions. Don't get in or out of relationships. Don't make big work changes. Because they would have these sort of like fluctuations where all or nothing would happen. And make these big pronouncements, and then I give up everything, right? And generally it was in a state of distress, because if you're hungry, right, your physical needs are not being met, you're angry, you're in a dysregulated emotional state, you're lonely, and sort of the decision making with a lonely, isolated person is off kilter because sort of any port in a storm, right? I've got to resolve that need. And then tired touches on that sleep issue. So there's kind of a secondary way to get at those 5 areas.
And listening to you, Jason, I want to talk about, you mentioned lonely, right? And I think this is also like something very important. There's a lot of research. I don't know if you heard some of these lectures that addiction many times, right, is a result of isolation. And again, to remember that isolation takes a toll on our nervous system. Different ways. For some people, it's addiction. For some people, it's depression. For some people, it's anxiety. So if somebody comes to me and say, you know what, I don't have the time or money for therapy, right? Mm-hmm. I don't believe in medication. I don't want to take them. What can I do? I would say, no, if you can just increase your movement and your connections, I think that can do wonders. And there's a lot of research that movement and connections can do wonders to our emotional system, to our nervous system. And for some people, that's part of the challenge, right? Like they struggle to connect. So I say, I don't know if you're Christian, Muslim, Jewish, go to a group in the synagogue, in the church, in the mosque. If you struggle with addiction, go to an AA group. Don't be alone, right? If you have one friend or one family member that you like, spend more time with them. Because isolation takes a toll on us. It's very difficult and very painful.
Well, you mentioned sleep deprivation is torture, but so is solitary confinement.
Yes.
I mean, and that's usually goes hand in hand with the sleep deprivation as part of the techniques. But some of the inhumane things that we do in the prisons, you're a bad boy, you're going to go to timeout, for weeks or months. And there's all these anecdotal stories about people emerge, very different people, people leaving prisons and things like that and saying, well, prison changed me. And of course it changed you. You underwent torture, basically. You were under constant threat for the period of time. But we transmit that into our daily lives. We put ourselves under that same kind of torture by not connecting. And movement and connection is a great kind of 1-2, keep it simple. I really, really like that a lot. So we're getting close to the end of our time here. So, this is a great conversation. We have to have Dr. Avi back. This is good. There's a lot of seeds there that I think a lot of avenues we could have definitely gone down and explored more fully. And we didn't talk about addiction yet. And I could talk about that all day long. So we'll have to get back together. If people are looking to find you or get started with you, how do they do that?
So I have a website. It's dravisanders.com. I'm also on Instagram where I share like pieces of information a few times a week. So if you want to join this community, which is slowly growing, it's dr.avi.anxiety.recovery. So Dr. Avi Anxiety Recovery with dots in the middle. And it's lovely to have more people there to hear opinions, to offer support, to get supported. It's a beautiful space.
Yep, and I've been there, and I will say that there's a lot of gold in your comments section, right? There is some connecting that is taking place for sure, and so I've been in that position, filming the videos and putting together the slides and stuff. Ian obviously helps me with most of that, and in the moment it can feel kind of like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? And then you post it, and you see these people connecting and bridging those gaps and some great ideas, and just that sense you talked about AA of just you're not alone, right? Is so important. So,
and that's for some people, that's another space to connect, right? That's the advantages, I think, of social media. Some people can go to social media and find support, find people who are going through a similar struggle.
Yeah.
Can I make a quick confession before we go?
Please, yeah. It's a safe space. Go for it.
So I wanted to say that before I came here today, I was feeling anxious, right? And I think in the beginning of the conversation, I was feeling anxious, and maybe there were moments through the conversation where I was feeling anxious. But that was my point. It was meaningful for me to come here today, right? Because that can be a space where I can connect with other people, you, maybe some of the listeners. Maybe I can share my knowledge that is meaningful for me, that is part of my work. So my goal was not to get rid of my anxiety, right? My goal was to say to my anxiety, that's okay. I know that you care about me, right? But I want to talk to Jason today. That's meaningful for me today. So again, if there's one idea that I want people who listen to take away from that, don't get into a power struggle with your anxiety. But you can do things despite feeling anxious. Like I could talk to you, I could connect with you, I could share ideas, I could listen to you and learn from you, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Despite feeling anxious, the anxiety didn't stand in my way. And I think that is the work, to relate to the anxiety differently rather than get rid of it. Because sometimes we need anxiety. It's there to protect us.
Well, and I want to support you, and I thank you for that transparent kind of confession, because again, the thought is that the people on our side of the table have all these answers, but we're human too, and we're having all these same experiences, and to push through that and participate, it's great that we had this conversation, but you contributed so much and shared so much during this time that there's no doubt somebody's going to hear this, and it's going to be the start of their healing. It's going to be the start of their progression, or they're going to get a moment of relief where like, oh, it's not just me, you know? So on behalf of that person, I appreciate you pushing through and doing it. Cause you know, I enjoyed the conversation and I hope you enjoyed it as well. But like I said, you gave a lot more than you got from this, I'm sure. You certainly contributed a lot, and I appreciate those contributions.
Oh, I got a lot out of it. And if you say that one person, it will make a difference for them, it was worth it, right?
Well, Ian alone looked more relaxed when you were talking over there. So if nothing else, you've got that on your side. So Dr. Avi, thank you so much. I appreciate it. We'll do this again very soon. And for everybody at home, I mean, you've heard the commercials, but I do always want to mention our sponsor, Anew Behavioral Health. You can obviously seek out Dr. Avi if you're in the New York, New Jersey area, especially. But, you know, if you're in Ohio or New Hampshire, Anew Behavioral Health has therapists and psychiatrists and psychologists and nurses and case managers standing by, willing to help you and wanting to assist you with your journey as well. You can find them at anewbh.com. So again, thank you, Ian, for the help today. Thank you, Dr. Avi. Appreciate it so much. And until next time, everybody out there, take care of yourself and take care of each other. Hey guys, although Through Help and Back is an excellent podcast with a lot of great ideas, I do want to let you know that in no way is Through Help and Back expected to be perceived as or relied upon in any way as specific medical advice or mental health advice for you personally. The information provided through Help and Back on our website or our podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment that can be provided by your own providers. Do not use our content in lieu of professional advice given by qualified medical professionals, and do not disregard professional medical advice or delay seeking professional advice because of the information you have read on our website, heard on our podcast, or otherwise received from us. Although we love discussing issues related to healthcare, mental health, and addiction, we are not providing direct healthcare, mental health care, medical, or nutrition therapy services. We're not attempting to diagnose, treat, prevent, or cure in any manner whatsoever any physical or psychological ailment, any mental or emotional issue, disease, or condition. We are not giving you specific medical, psychological, or religious advice whatsoever. Please take care of yourself and take care of others as you always seek the advice of your own medical providers and your own mental health providers regarding any questions or concerns you have about your specific health, or before implementing any recommendations or suggestions from us. These are ideas that have worked for other people. We think it's important to share them. We do not guarantee that they will work for you specifically. Do not stop taking any medications without speaking to your physician, nurse practitioner, physician assistant, mental health provider, or any other healthcare or medical professional. And if you have or suspect that you have a medical or mental health issue, contact your own healthcare provider promptly. Also, one last thing, if you know or suspect that you are currently experiencing a crisis, it is absolutely imperative that you seek the advice of your doctor or other emergency healthcare services prior to ever thinking about using our content. We love the conversations. We're glad you're stopping by. We hope you take a lot from the content. But again, for your specific individual medical situation, please always seek quality personal care from your own providers. Do not let this information or this advice stand on its own. Thanks so much for listening.